And now, your host, Phil Yates!
Thank you, Jeff the Fish. I am Phil Yates, your Week 14 replacement host, and Matthew's out with a zombie bite to the stomach. And today on the show, we're here talking Carson Wentz fallout, the suddenly relevant 49ers, and Tim Hasselbeck also stopped by, so Secret Squirrel. Today's show will be...
Free parking. It's free parking. You get free money, right? It all goes in the middle?
I have no idea what that means.
It's Monopoly.
So Eagles coach Doug Peterson has confirmed that Carson Wentz suffered a torn ACL against the Rams. He's done for the season. First of all, get well soon, Carson. Here's to a speedy recovery. It's a tough day for the Eagles, Eagles fans, and even our Eagle, usually so fluffy with a strong, piercing caw. But today, the Eagle just doesn't look like himself, and his caw sounds somehow different. Obviously, if you have Wentz on your fantasy roster, there's no positive spin on his injury. But if you have other Eagles, we don't see a massive drop-off. Nick Foles came in cold in the third quarter yesterday and showed pretty well. 6 for 10 for 42 yards, including a clutch strike to Nelson Agholor late that clinched the win. Foles is not Wentz, of course, but don't forget, he's had big-time success in a Philly offense before when he was surrounded by similar high-end talent. In 2013, Foles threw for 27 touchdowns to just 2 interceptions and was QB3 per game on the season. I still see Alshon Jeffrey as a wide receiver 2 with Foles and Zach Ertz as a set-it-and-forget-it tight end 1 as soon as he returns from injury. And the Eagles' run game could get a boost, assuming Doug Peterson doesn't have Foles chucking around 30 to 40 times a game like Wentz often did. Jay Ajayi got 15 carries Sunday, almost double his best workload previously with the Eagles. So that's the Eagles. Reason to panic from a real perspective? Sure, just not in fantasy as of yet. Well, I don't think the injury to their starting quarterback portends certain fantasy doom for the Eagles. The same can't be said for another team in green and white that likely lost its quarterback yesterday. Josh McCown of the Jets broke his hand, and let me break some news to you. Bryce Petty and Christian Hackenberg are not Josh McCown, and they're not Nick Foles. The Jets surprised us all by being fantasy relevant this year, but those days could be over. Jermaine Kearse, 48 fantasy points combined in weeks 12 and 13, and wide receiver 25 on the season, has been one of the fantasy revelations of the year. But going forward, I don't see how you can trust him. Austin Seferian-Jenkins, already on the decline over the last few weeks, he now can't be near your lineup. He hasn't had double-digit fantasy points since week 10, hasn't scored a touchdown, at least not one that was allowed, since week 7. The only Jet who still does deserve a spot in this post-McCown world, Robbie Anderson, wide receiver 15 on the season and wide receiver 8 since week. He does have some history with Bryce Petty. In 4 games with Petty under center last year, Anderson averaged 15 fantasy points per game, which would make him top 15 wide receiver on a points per game basis. But that's it for the Jets. Robbie Anderson and absolutely no one else needs to be rostered right now. Come on, Zing. If you started some random running back this week in the fantasy playoffs, 1, why did you do that? And 2, great job. Jonathan Stewart, who hadn't scored more than 27 fantasy points over any 3-week stretch this season, had 28 against the vaunted Vikings defense on Sunday. Theo Riddick, who entered week 14 as RB30, put up 27 fantasy points, the second most in a game in his career. And Rod Smith, a name that was last fantasy relevant a decade ago when breathe right strips were still a thing, that name is back and now being used by a Cowboys running back who entered week 14 with just 40 fantasy points on the whole season. But then he posted 33 on Sunday against the Giants. So if you rolled the dice on any of those guys to open the fantasy playoffs, nice job. But to paraphrase the great sports philosopher Lou Brown, nice job. Don't ever bleep and do it again. I just don't see Stewart, Riddick, or Smith getting anywhere near those numbers the rest of the season. Stewart hasn't had more than 18 carries all season and hasn't caught a pass since week 5. He is entirely a touchdown-dependent back now with Christian McCaffrey in the mix, which makes Stewart nothing more than a risky flex play. Riddick had a season-high 10 carries, but that was only because Amir Abdullah was out. His 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 games were all with him on the bench. Abdullah was quarterly close to playing this Sunday. If he's back next week, Riddick's the one that belongs back on a bench. And Rod Smith, I love his long-term upside as a player, but Alfred Morris out-touched him on Sunday 22-11. Smith got a big chunk of his fantasy points on one play, an 81-yard touchdown catch. Dallas is a great matchup next against that woeful Raiders defense, but Smith isn't getting enough touches to play him in fantasy with any level of confidence. Remember, don't get cute in the fantasy playoffs. Go with your stars. People always ask me two questions when I'm out in public. One, who should I start this week? And two, what's the deal with Daniel Dopp's stupid beard? Well, I always give the same answers. Can you give me a minute? I'm trying to take a leak. And Dopp's beard? That's because his full-time gig is being an old-timey prospector.
What in tarnation? I've been paying for 49ers all season. I ain't found nothing around here.
Are you sure about that, prospecting squirrel? Look closer. We said 2 weeks ago that Garoppolo couldn't be started until he showed something. But he's starting to show something. 330 yards passing Sunday with his fantasy points jumping from 10 to 15. And now this week, the Niners get the Titans at home. Marquise Goodwin is an even better find. In the last 2 weeks since Jimmy Garoppolo took over as the starting quarterback, Goodwin has 14 catches, 205 yards, and 34 fantasy points. He's wide receiver 15 on a points per game basis this week's 10. He's a possible wide receiver 2 or even a flex play going forward.
I found Marquise Goodwin, Field. He's somehow still available in 60% of leagues. Yahoo! 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 I'm going to be rich. I'm going to be rich. Yeah!
Congrats on striking gold, Daniel, because I wasn't going to give you a raise. But I do have some potentially bad news. While the 49ers get Tennessee this week, in Week 16, they play the best defense in football, the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Dang nabbit, I've been hornswoggled.
There are three major life questions that weigh on my mind every day. Where do we go when we die? And are there puppets there? Is the bear of bad news a talking bear or just a man in a bear suit? And how is it possible that Aaron Rodgers is available in 35% of leagues on ESPN.com? Like what? Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers, the #1 quarterback in fantasy football, set to come off injured reserve this week, and he's just sitting out there for the taking in a ton of leagues. So Daniel Dopp, I ask you this. What do you see out of Aaron Rodgers in Week 15?
First off, Rodgers needs to be rostered in every single league across the board. The question for me is, though, am I able to start him in a win-or-go-home matchup in the first week back? I'm a little bit worried that I throw him out there. It depends on who else I have at quarterback, but can you trust him in Week 1 if you lose, knowing that Aaron Rodgers might not have been totally ready to come back?
Wait, aren't you a Lions fan?
I am. Has nothing to do with it.
You're supposed to know the brilliance of Aaron Rodgers.
100%.
Of course you can trust him. He would be a top probably 3 play for me when rankings come out later this week for Week 15.
Okay, so then my next question is, can you trust Jordy Nelson right away with how bad he has looked? Because the other Packers wide receivers haven't looked as bad with Brett Hundley.
Think about this. In the full 16 games before Aaron Rodgers' injury, Jordy Nelson was the #1 wide receiver in terms of total points in fantasy football. To me, yes, Jordy Nelson vaults right back up into that top 10, maybe top 15 for wide receivers for Week 15.
Okay, all right.
You're a Lions fan.
I know.
Better.
I know.
Time for Fantasy Frustrations presented by E-Trade, and Joseph tweets us, can I borrow the bitter berry? After losing Kamara on the first series on Thursday, I had a 1-point lead with 1 second in the Eagles versus Rams game, and yes, the other guy had the Eagles defense. Sigh. Hey, I get it. The Rams are down by 2 points with 1 second left, and they try to run the Stanford band play, only to fumble and have the Eagles return it for a touchdown. And they took a knee on the 2-point conversion as well, forfeiting more fantasy points? If it's any consolation, you're not the only person who lost a fantasy game because of that. We got a bunch of tweets. Time for some more frustrations, the kind of leaving us asking, what the just happened? Crazy voice guy, take it away.
Jimmy Graham had 2 targets and 0 catches in Jacksonville. That's 0.0 points in the fantasy playoffs. Thanks, Jimmy. What the just happened?
First of all, great math there on the 0.0 fantasy points. And I hear you. If you're frustrated with Jimmy Graham, consider this. He carried your team for the 8 games prior to this one against Jacksonville when he had 9 touchdowns. And despite this bagel on Sunday, he still leads the NFL with 23 red zone targets. Other than Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, and maybe a healthy Zach Ertz, there isn't a tight end I would prefer in my lineup more than Jimmy Graham. You got to hang tight with him going forward. Jimmy Graham still a set-it-and-forget-it tight end every single week. The Seahawks offense continues to be very good running through Russell Wilson. What's next?
Sterling Shepard had 2 catches for 16 yards against the Cowboys. Oh, and he rushed for -9 yards too. Great. What the Phil Simms just happened?
First of all, there was some mystery whether or not Sterling Shepard would actually play in this game because he's been dealing with injuries of late, and he really disappointed. As you noted, 2.7 fantasy points, and that was in a game in which Eli Manning threw the ball 46 times. 3 targets in total for Sterling Shepard. He has just 1 touchdown all season. I love the talent, and yes, there are very few established pass catchers on the Giants offense that I trust right now, but Sterling Shepard, the reality is, he's just not one of them. He belongs on your bench or off your roster at the moment. Next.
Mike Evans recorded just 2 catches for 25 yards against the Lions. What the fuck just happened?
Dude, I really feel you on this one. As in, Mike Evans, the 9th highest drafted player on average prior to the season. The 5th wide receiver on average drafted prior to the season. A season low 5 targets, which resulted in that 4.5 fantasy points in PPR scoring, and just 11 targets in the 2 games since Jameis Winston has returned. It feels like, honestly, Jameis Winston in this Bucs offense runs through everybody. There are so many pass catchers. Heck, an offensive lineman caught a touchdown for the Buccaneers on Sunday. All that being said, Mike Evans, too much of a stud for me to not have in my lineup every single week. The upside is off the charts for Mike Evans, even in Week 15 against the Atlanta Falcons, of course, on Monday Night Football on ESPN. Next.
Robbie Anderson had only 3 catches for 27 yards in Denver. What the Fifth Avenue just happened?
Fifth Avenue, I see what you did there. Yes, very disappointing for Robbie Anderson. And let's be honest, this game was basically a broken one for the Jets early on. No pun intended on the fact that Josh McCown broke his left non-throwing hand, and Robbie Anderson gets 3 catches, 27 yards. Now it's probably going to be Bryce Petty going forward as the starter. And there was a little bit of a rapport, actually, between Anderson and Bryce Petty last year in 4 games, which is why if there is a dart throw on the Jets roster that I'm still comfortable with going forward, it is Robbie Anderson. He still is so prone, in a good way, to scoring touchdowns. How about next?
Kirk Cousins threw for just 151 yards and a pick against the Chargers. What the free agency just happened?
Trust me, Kirk Cousins is going to love free agency if he even gets that far because he's going to get paid. But yeah, it was brutal on Sunday. And speaking of a team that is so banged up right now, the offensive line for Washington, a total mess. The backfield obviously lost both Rob Kelly and Chris Thompson. 8.8 fantasy points in a completely overmatched game against the LA Chargers. And, you know, next week, I'm just not sure it's that much better against an Arizona Cardinals defense that completely flustered Marcus Mariota to the tune of 3.5 fantasy points in Week 14. Kirk Cousins will be on the border of my top 10 quarterbacks, but I totally get it if you rather stream somebody else in that slot this week.
By E-Trade.
After Monday Night Football, stay tuned for SportsCenter with Scott Van Pelt, unless I have that show too, in which case, you're excused.
And now it's time for the bald and the beautiful with Fields Yates. Oh my gosh, that's terrifying.
Tim Hasselbeck is here, and our producers were too lazy to change the name of this segment. So let's
Could have
talk
done bald
about.
and beautiful, man. You could have just been beautiful. You know, you
See,
were good.
Tim, I like where your
Too nice,
head
yes.
is at. Your bald head is at. Let's talk about some of these Week 14 performances. And Dak Prescott, his first 300-yard passing game of the season. It was against a bad Giants team. But what do you make of this from Dak?
Well, I think we could see more of this from Dak. I mean, look, I think he's a better passer than he maybe is given credit for because of how that offense works when Zeke is in there. Look, you got a big play out of Rod Smith, and you got a big play out of Dez Bryant as well. And you think about Jason Witten in the red zone. So I think in a matchup against Oakland, who's also been terrible this coming week, I think Dak could end up being a decent option for you if you're scrambling at the quarterback position.
Believe it or not, when you keep your quarterback upright, and he was not sacked on Sunday, he's got a much better chance to be successful. I like the matchup this week in Week 15 against Oakland, but that Week 16 matchup against Seattle is really hovering there for Dak Prescott, which makes me a little bit nervous. I'd be carrying a second quarterback as well. Maybe it's Ben Roethlisberger. 66 passing attempts and over 500 yards against the Ravens last night. That's on a misspeak. The Ravens are supposed to be really good on defense. Is Big Ben a QB the rest of the way?
I don't think he's a QB1 the rest of the way. I mean, think of a matchup against New England. I don't think that this coming week, I don't think we'll see 66 attempts, and then I don't think we'll see similar type of success with the way that New England's defense has been playing, you know, currently right now, you know, since Week 7, the third toughest defense versus quarterback. So, but then you look at Houston and Cleveland. I do think Ben is going to be ranked inside the top 10 when you and Matthew and the rest of the guys do the rankings. And so So maybe not this week, but again, depending on what your matchup is, yeah, Ben could easily end up in your lineup.
Yeah, I think the good news is the matchup against New England probably still keeps Ben because he's at home inside the top 12 or so for this week. And then he could legitimately be a top 5 quarterback option in 16 and 17 if you make it that far. So a quarterback would help carry you to glory. Trey Burton was awesome filling in for Zach Ertz yesterday. Pair of touchdowns. If Ertz doesn't play next week and there's no Wentz, could Trey Burton stay on that flex radar or a tight end 1 radar?
Yeah, I think I have to stair step this there. So let's just assume that everything else with the Eagles offense was the same, then Trey Burton, I believe, and we've talked about it on Fantasy Football Now a bunch of Sheffield. Yeah, he kind of fills in for Zach Ertz. He's kind of that, that tight end that has the ability to win one-on-chips. I think the concern of now is what the changes will be with this Philadelphia Eagles offense. They're going from, an MVP candidate at the quarterback position, probably, maybe MVP favorite, to, a guy that I don't think his skill set is really set up to play really well, doing the same things that Philadelphia has been doing. So I just think this entire Eagles offense is going to take a step back.
D.D. Westbrook's been pretty good for the Jaguars since being activated off short-term IR. Another game with at least 5 catches and a great touchdown celebration after his first NFL score.
Here's the thing. I don't know if there's enough volume of work, and I don't know if Blake Bortles is going to continue to play as well as he played against the Seahawks, even though he is playing with his most confidence. I think, look, flex consideration on D.D. Westbrook because of the target share, and then let's face it, matchups with Houston, San Francisco, and then Tennessee. Yeah, I think at that point, you at least have a decision to make on Westbrook, and he's worth rostering.
Jacksonville could be staring down 12 wins this season.
That's crazy.
Hey, kid, what's going on there? Good job there. I heard you mention Westbrook. Finally, someone on this show is talking Westbrook. Really mature of you, although what is this? This mess over here with the cups and the Christmas tree. This isn't the Beta House, kid.
It's decorative.
All right, since you talked about Westbrook, how about you talk about LeBron next, huh?
Well, can I give you Eric Ebron at least?
Yeah, LeBron. Okay, do it, kid.
Eric Ebron it is. Eric Ebron, the Lions tight end, a favorite of this show to make bad LeBron puns, and he had 10 catches on Sunday. Did fumble the football. An athletic guy, Tim, and it feels like we've been waiting for him to break out for like 4 years now. Was Sunday a sign of things to come?
I think in a way, since, they're basically the second half of the season is going to be much better for Eric Ebron than the first half of the season. And I think that if you look at a matchup against Chicago, who's, that's been a team that's been good against the tight end, maybe isn't great, and Cincinnati and Green Bay to finish the season. I think Eric Ebron, especially as we've kind of been navigating these tight ends between guys like, Tyler Kroft and Jack Doyle and Charles Clay. Yeah, I think Eric Ebron certainly could end up being a guy that's a good play.
He's like a lot of other tight ends, other than like a core 5. He's a tight end, too, who comes with a lot of risk and some potential upside. That's just the nature of that position. Time now for a blind resume. These 2 wide receivers both rank inside the top 22 on a per-game basis.
The show was presented by E-Trade, the original place to invest online.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Show, and we showed you a blind resume of 2 receivers with nearly identical numbers this season. They are Alshon Jeffrey and Hogan. Hogan will make his return after missing the last 4 games with a shoulder injury, that according to our own Adam Schefter. It's time for our daily reminder to don't be this guy. Today's fantasy loser sucked on the world's spiciest lollipop, the toe of Satan. Ew. After a few minutes, he had to cool down with milk, cookies, and a whole lot of ice cream. This feels like the one-chip challenge, Daniel, in sweet form. Thoughts?
Yeah, the problem is he gets to eat a lollipop, and then he gets to eat cookies, and then he gets to eat ice cream.
But shouldn't the ice cream and the milk actually help cool down? Aren't those cooling agents for your mouth after a spice?
I gotta be honest, one thing I've never done, never put Satan's toe in my mouth.
That's a good point, Daniel. You and I share that in common.
Yeah.
Kareem Hunt jersey, though. He's got that going for him. That's good. Kareem Hunt was sweet, week 14.
You think it tickles?
Not at all.